Nazi human experimentation remains one of the most horrific chapters in human history, driven by an ideology that prioritized the pursuit of scientific advancements over basic human rights and ethical boundaries. Joseph Mengele, often known as the Angel of Death, is the most infamous figure associated with these atrocities. He carried out inhumane experiments at Auschwitz concentration camp where he subjected thousands of men, women, and children to unimaginable horrors under the guise of scientific research. Mengele's experiments were driven by his obsession with genetics, racial purity, and the advancement of Nazi ideology, pushing the boundaries of cruelty in ways that defied human comprehension. Mengele's most infamous experiments involved twins, whom he selected for his studies. He viewed them as valuable for studying genetic similarities and differences, and this led to a series of horrific experiments carried out without anesthesia or consent. Twins were subjected to surgical procedures, including the removal of organs, limbs, and eyes. They were also injected with various substances to observe the effects on their bodies. If one twin survived a procedure, Mengele would often kill the other in order to compare the effects of the experiment on the two individuals. These twins were treated as little more than specimens, their lives expendable for the sake of Nazi research. Many of them died as a result of the procedures, while others were left permanently disfigured or mentally scarred. In addition to his work with twins, Mengele and other Nazi doctors conducted a variety of other inhumane experiments, including freezing and thawing tests. Prisoners were exposed to freezing cold for hours to study the effects of hypothermia, and then quickly placed in scalding hot water to observe the damage caused by rapid temperature changes. Many victims died from the shock, while others suffered severe injuries like frostbite, loss of limbs, and organ failure. The Nazi regime was also heavily invested in biological warfare and sought to use human experimentation to create effective weapons. As part of this agenda, victims were injected with deadly diseases like typhus, tuberculosis, and cholera to observe the progression of these illnesses. Some prisoners were deliberately exposed to germ warfare agents, and entire camps were used to test the effects of biological warfare on humans. The suffering was unimaginable, as the prisoners endured extreme pain and often died from the diseases. In addition to biological and genetic experiments, the Nazis also conducted tests to examine the limits of human endurance. Saltwater experiments were another brutal practice in which prisoners were forced to drink large quantities of saltwater in an attempt to simulate the effects of dehydration and starvation. They were often left to die in agony, while their bodies were studied to learn how long a human could survive under extreme conditions. These experiments were not limited to concentration camps in Europe. The Nazi regime also carried out horrific studies in other territories under their control, including the Soviet Union and parts of Poland. The doctors and scientists involved in these experiments were driven by their loyalty to the Nazi regime and their desire to advance the cause of racial purity, scientific superiority, and military dominance. What is particularly disturbing is the fact that after the war ended, many of these doctors and researchers were not brought to justice for their crimes. Joseph Mengele himself managed to evade capture for years, living under false identities in South America. The U.S. government, in particular, made a deal with many of these Nazi scientists, offering them protection in exchange for the data they had collected during the experiments. This arrangement allowed the perpetrators of these horrific crimes to live out their lives without facing punishment for the suffering they had inflicted. The legacy of Nazi human experimentation is a chilling reminder of how far human beings can go in the name of science and ideology. The experiments conducted by Mengele and his colleagues serve as a stark warning about the dangers of unchecked power, the exploitation of vulnerable populations, and the dehumanization of individuals for the sake of progress. These atrocities were not just medical experiments, they were acts of unimaginable cruelty, fueled by an ideology that saw certain human lives as expendable. The impact of these crimes continues to resonate today, reminding us of the importance of ethics in scientific research and the need to protect human dignity at all costs. The story of Nazi human experimentation is not just a historical one, it's a warning that the pursuit of knowledge must always be balanced with a deep sense of humanity and responsibility. The pain and suffering inflicted on the victims of these experiments should never be forgotten, and we must continue to learn from these horrors to ensure that such atrocities are never repeated. The Tuskegee syphilis study, conducted from 1932 to 1972 in the United States, stands as one of the most unethical and horrifying medical experiments in modern history. The study was conducted by the U.S. Public Health Service and was initially intended to observe the natural progression of untreated syphilis in African American men. However, the study became infamous due to its unethical methods and the gross violation of the participants' human rights. The Tuskegee experiment lasted for 40 years, and during this time, the men involved were manipulated, deceived, and denied medical treatment. Even when effective treatments became available. The study began in 1932 in Macon County, Alabama, targeting a group of 600 African American men, 399 of whom had syphilis, while the remaining 201 men were used as a control group. The participants were promised free healthcare, meals, and burial insurance. However, what they were not told was that they were part of an experiment, and their syphilis was intentionally left untreated. Even after penicillin, the most effective cure, became widely available in the 1940s. The researchers behind the study believed that syphilis was more common among African Americans and wanted to study the disease's effects without offering treatment. Instead of providing the men with medical care, the researchers misled them into believing they were being treated for bad blood, a term often used at the time to describe a variety of ailments. The participants were never informed of the true nature of their condition or the fact that their syphilis was not being treated. Many were told that they were receiving a special treatment, but in reality, they were given placebos or ineffective medications. The most egregious aspect of the Tuskegee study was the deliberate withholding of treatment for syphilis, even as penicillin became recognized as a safe and effective cure in the early 1940s. As time passed, the participants' condition worsened, and many suffered from severe health complications, including blindness, organ damage, and death. Some of the men passed the disease on to their wives and children, further exacerbating the devastating impact of the study. Despite the availability of penicillin, which could have saved their lives, the researchers refused to treat the participants. Instead, they continued to observe their decline as part of their research. The study continued for decades, with participants never being informed of the ethical concerns or the medical advancements that could have alleviated their suffering. The U.S. government and the medical community remained silent about the study, and it was only after a whistleblower, Peter Buxton, a public health service employee, exposed the study in 1972 that the truth came to light. Buxton had grown increasingly concerned about the unethical nature of the study and had repeatedly urged officials to end it, but his warnings were ignored. Finally, when the media uncovered the story, public outrage forced the government to terminate the study and offer apologies to the survivors and their families. By the time the study was ended, 128 of the original participants had died from syphilis or complications related to the disease. 40 wives had been infected, and 19 children were born with congenital syphilis, all of whom were affected by the decision to withhold treatment. The Tuskegee study left lasting scars on the African American community, creating a deep distrust in the medical establishment that persists today. In response to the Tuskegee study, the U.S. government was forced to take action, leading to significant reforms in ethical guidelines for medical research. In 1974, the National Research Act was passed, establishing the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. This commission was tasked with creating new ethical standards for medical research, including the requirement for informed consent and the establishment of institutional review boards, IRBs, to ensure the ethical treatment of participants in research studies. The Tuskegee syphilis study serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of racial prejudice, medical exploitation, and the violation of human rights in the name of science. It exposed the deep flaws in the U.S. healthcare system at the time, where the lives of African American individuals were treated as expendable. The study not only caused immense suffering but also undermined the trust of the African American community in the medical field, a legacy that still affects medical research and healthcare today. The Tuskegee experiment represents one of the darkest moments in medical history and has left a lasting impact on how research ethics are approached. It serves as a constant reminder of the need for transparency, accountability, and respect for the dignity of individuals in all medical and scientific endeavors. The victims of the Tuskegee study and their families deserve recognition and remembrance, and their story is a powerful lesson in the importance of human rights, equity, and justice in medical research. MKUltra, a secretive and controversial program run by the CIA during the 1950s through the 1970s, remains one of the most notorious instances of government-sanctioned mind control experiments in modern history. The project aimed to explore methods of controlling the human mind, utilizing a range of extreme and often unethical techniques in the pursuit of discovering ways to manipulate behavior, extract information, and develop biological weapons. The experiments conducted under MKUltra were shrouded in secrecy, and many of the details only emerged decades later, shedding light on the shocking and inhumane nature of the program. The origins of MKUltra trace back to the Cold War era, a time when the United States was embroiled in a fierce ideological battle with the Soviet Union, China, and other communist nations. In the context of international espionage, the CIA was determined to gain an upper hand by investigating techniques that could be used for psychological warfare. They sought to develop ways to manipulate individuals through a variety of methods, including drugs, hypnosis, and sensory deprivation. The goal was to create the ultimate mind control agent, capable of turning individuals into unwitting spies or sleeper agents, or even extracting information from prisoners through extreme psychological means. One of the most infamous components of MKUltra was the use of LSD, which was tested on unwitting participants, often without their consent or knowledge. The CIA believed that psychedelic drugs like LSD could be used to break down a person's mental defenses, making them susceptible to interrogation or manipulation. In the early stages of the project, the CIA began experimenting with LSD on both military personnel and civilians, including mental patients, prisoners, and even ordinary citizens. The agency's researchers believed that these drugs could help manipulate or control the behavior of individuals, but the results were disastrous. The experiments were often carried out in completely unethical and harmful ways. For example, individuals were given LSD without their knowledge, sometimes in food or drink, and monitored to see how the drug affected their behavior. In some cases, patients were subjected to weeks or even months of LSD treatments, often in isolation, to see if the drug could break down their resistance and alter their personality or thought processes. Many of the subjects had no idea they were being experimented on and were never informed of the risks or the true nature of the study. Some individuals suffered severe psychological effects from the drug, including paranoia, hallucinations, and permanent mental damage. The CIA's experiments didn't stop with LSD. They also explored a variety of other techniques to control the mind, such as hypnosis, electroshock therapy, and sensory deprivation. One particularly disturbing method involved the use of mind-altering substances to hypnotize subjects into performing actions without their consent, as well as experimenting with ways to enhance the effects of hypnosis on memory and behavior. In other cases, subjects were deprived of sensory input, often placed in dark, soundproof rooms, to test how isolation and sensory deprivation could be used to break a person's mental resistance and extract information. Another cruel experiment involved the use of electroshock therapy, in which subjects were subjected to extreme doses of electrical shocks in an attempt to change their behavior and brain patterns. These experiments were often administered to vulnerable populations, including mental patients, without their consent, and the consequences were devastating. The combination of drug-induced states, hypnosis, and electroshock often caused subjects to experience severe mental distress, and many were left with permanent psychological damage. The CIA also worked with various universities and hospitals to conduct these experiments. Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, the head of the MKUltra program, was one of the key figures involved in the project. His team at Fort Detrick, a U.S. Army biological warfare research facility, was responsible for administering many of the experiments. The program was so secretive that it was operated under false pretenses, often misleading doctors, researchers, and participants about the true purpose of the experiments. Despite the immense suffering and harm inflicted on the individuals involved, the MKUltra project was shrouded in secrecy for years. In 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of most of the MKUltra documents, ensuring that many of the details remained classified for decades. However, some documents eventually surfaced in the 1970s, thanks to efforts by journalists and government whistleblowers, and the full scale of the program began to come to light. In 1975, Congress held hearings to investigate the MKUltra program, and survivors and families of victims began to come forward, revealing the extent of the abuse. The revelation of MKUltra sparked outrage and horror, leading to a public outcry over the CIA's use of unethical methods and the violation of the human rights of those involved. The government was forced to address the issue, and a series of reforms were introduced in the years following the exposure of MKUltra, including more stringent regulations around human experimentation and informed consent. The legacy of MKUltra remains one of the darkest moments in U.S. history, serving as a reminder of the potential for government overreach, secrecy, and the willingness of powerful organizations to exploit vulnerable individuals for the sake of national security or scientific advancement. It serves as a chilling warning about the dangers of unchecked government power and the ethical boundaries that must be upheld in scientific research. While many of the subjects of MKUltra never knew they were part of the experiment, their stories have been passed down as a testament to the suffering and abuse they endured. Some survivors have lived with the trauma of the experiments for decades, struggling with the psychological scars left by the CIA's ruthless pursuit of mind control. MKUltra not only destroyed lives but also shook the trust between the American public and the institutions meant to protect them. The program remains a stark reminder of the need for transparency, accountability, and an unwavering commitment to human rights in all areas of scientific and governmental activity. The St. Thomas Hospital baby experiment, conducted in the 1960s in England, represents one of the darkest chapters in the history of medical research, particularly when it comes to unethical experimentation on vulnerable individuals, such as infants. This experiment, which took place at St. Thomas Hospital in London, was designed to study the effects of severe deprivation on babies, specifically focusing on the development of attachment and the consequences of emotional neglect. What makes the St. Thomas experiment especially shocking is not just the nature of the experiment itself, but the fact that it involved infants who were deliberately subjected to neglect as part of the research process. The experiment was led by a group of psychologists and medical researchers who were primarily concerned with studying child development, specifically the effects of maternal separation on young children. The researchers were heavily influenced by the theories of John Bowlby, a British psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, who had developed the concept of attachment theory. According to Bowlby, children needed a stable, consistent emotional bond with a primary caregiver to develop normally, both emotionally and psychologically. While Bowlby advocated for providing children with supportive and nurturing care, the St. Thomas experiment, in contrast, sought to test the impact of emotional deprivation and separation in a disturbing and unethical manner. In the early 1960s, the experimenters at St. Thomas Hospital began selecting infants who were either born prematurely or who were suffering from other medical conditions, such as heart defects or lung problems. These infants, often from lower-income backgrounds or disadvantaged families, were then placed in a special nursery where they were subjected to a range of cruel practices. The babies were separated from their mothers or primary caregivers for extended periods, under the false premise that this would allow researchers to measure the effects of separation on their development. However, what the researchers failed to adequately recognize or address was the profound psychological and emotional damage that these separations were causing. The babies were often left alone for hours in sterile, isolated conditions, without any comforting presence or emotional connection. They were denied physical affection, holding, or any kind of emotional reassurance, all of which are crucial for a child's development. The babies were observed constantly during these periods of emotional deprivation, and their reactions, such as increased crying, distress, and withdrawal, were recorded and studied. The cruelty of the experiment was compounded by the fact that the babies were also subjected to various medical procedures without the consent of their parents. These procedures, which included painful tests and treatments, were often conducted with little regard for the emotional well-being of the infants. The researchers, rather than intervening to protect the babies from distress, continued to monitor and document the effects of their neglect on the infant's emotional and physical health. The findings from the St. Thomas baby experiment were published in 1967, but the implications of the study were not as beneficial or informative as the researchers might have hoped. While the study did indeed show that babies subjected to extreme neglect and separation experienced severe emotional distress, the cost of obtaining this information was unimaginable suffering for the infants involved. The babies who survived the study often exhibited long-term emotional and behavioral problems, including difficulty forming secure attachments later in life and an increased risk of mental health issues. Many of them showed signs of attachment disorders, anxiety, and depression, which persisted throughout their childhoods. The controversy surrounding the St. Thomas baby experiment eventually led to public outrage once details of the study began to surface. The ethical violations of the experiment were shocking to the public, especially when it became clear that the babies had been subjected to neglect and harm in the name of scientific inquiry. The study also sparked debates about the ethics of research involving vulnerable populations, particularly infants and children who cannot consent to participation in medical experiments. The legacy of the St. Thomas baby experiment continues to influence ethical standards in medical research, especially concerning studies that involve vulnerable populations such as children. The lack of informed consent, the disregard for emotional welfare, and the manipulation of infants for the sake of observation contributed to the growing recognition of the need for strict ethical guidelines in medical research. The St. Thomas experiment helped lay the groundwork for the establishment of ethical standards that prioritize the rights, welfare, and dignity of research subjects, particularly when they cannot advocate for themselves. As a result of the public outcry and subsequent legal actions, the St. Thomas Hospital baby experiment was widely condemned, and many of the researchers involved in the study faced scrutiny for their unethical practices. The experiment, while intended to advance understanding of child development, ultimately did far more harm than good. It remains a stark reminder of the vulnerability of children in the face of medical and scientific authority, and the lengths to which some researchers are willing to go in the name of science. The St. Thomas baby experiment is a tragic example of how scientific curiosity, when unchecked by ethical considerations, can lead to unimaginable harm. It highlights the importance of ethics in medical research, particularly when dealing with those who are unable to provide consent, and underscores the necessity of placing the welfare of individuals above the pursuit of knowledge. This experiment, like others in the history of unethical medical research, serves as a poignant lesson in the critical need for compassionate, respectful treatment of all individuals involved in scientific studies. The electric shock obedience experiment, conducted by psychologist Stanley Milgram in 1961, stands as one of the most famous and ethically controversial studies in the history of psychology. Milgram's experiment was designed to investigate the extent to which individuals would obey authority figures, even when it meant inflicting harm on another person. The results of the study were shocking and deeply unsettling, revealing the disturbing lengths to which ordinary people might go when ordered by an authority figure, raising profound questions about obedience, morality, and human nature. The experiment was inspired by the events of World War II, particularly the actions of Nazi officials who claimed they were merely following orders when carrying out atrocities. Milgram, deeply disturbed by the unquestioning obedience displayed by individuals involved in such acts, sought to explore whether the same tendencies could be observed in ordinary people, especially in the context of a laboratory setting. He wanted to understand how far people would go when asked to administer pain to another person, even if they knew that person was suffering. In the experiment, participants were recruited under the guise of a study on learning and memory, and were told they would be participating in an experiment to test the effects of punishment on learning. Each participant was assigned the role of teacher, while another person, who was actually an actor, known as the learner, was strapped into a chair in another room. The teacher was instructed to administer an electric shock to the learner every time they made a mistake on a memory task. The shocks began at a relatively mild voltage but increased with each mistake, eventually escalating to levels that would be considered lethal. The most disturbing part of Milgram's experiment was that the electric shocks were not real. The learner was an actor who was not actually receiving any shocks. However, the teacher did not know this. The shocks ranged from a low 15 volts to a lethal 450 volts. As the teacher continued to administer the shocks, the learner would begin to scream in pain and beg for mercy, eventually falling silent, as though unconscious or possibly dead. Despite the apparent suffering of the learner, the experimenter, an authoritative figure dressed in a white lab coat, encouraged the teacher to continue, reassuring them that they must continue with the experiment and that the responsibility for any harm would rest with the researcher, not the participant. Milgram's findings were deeply alarming. Contrary to what he expected, a significant number of participants were willing to administer the highest levels of shock, even when they were clearly distressed by the apparent suffering of the learner. In fact, about 65% of participants administered the maximum shock, despite hearing the learner scream in agony and beg for the experiment to stop. Many participants showed visible signs of tension and anxiety, such as sweating, trembling, and even having doubts about the morality of their actions, yet they continued to follow the instructions of the authority figure. Milgram concluded that ordinary people could commit extraordinary acts of cruelty under the influence of an authoritative figure. His results suggested that obedience to authority could override a person's moral values, and that individuals might act in ways they would normally deem unacceptable if they were told by someone in a position of power to do so. The experiment highlighted the power of authority in the situational factors that could influence human behavior, particularly in contexts of perceived responsibility or distance from the consequences of one's actions. Milgram's study raised significant ethical concerns. Many of the participants were deeply traumatized by the experience of having caused pain to another person, even though they had not actually harmed anyone. Some even expressed regret and guilt after the experiment was over. The study also brought to light the psychological harm that can be caused by such deceptive research, as participants were misled about the true nature of the experiment, leading to feelings of betrayal and distress. The deception used in Milgram's experiment, telling participants that they were harming someone when they actually weren't, was controversial. Many ethical guidelines for psychological research today would not allow such an experiment to be conducted without explicit informed consent and a careful consideration of the participants' well-being. However, despite the ethical criticisms, Milgram's experiment has had a lasting impact on the field of psychology in our understanding of human behavior. It is often cited in discussions about obedience, authority, and the dark side of human nature. In the aftermath of the experiment, Milgram continued to explore the factors that influence obedience in various contexts. His work sparked a broad debate about the role of authority and personal responsibility, and his findings have been used to explain how individuals can become complicit in harmful actions under authoritarian regimes or during wartime. The study has been interpreted as a warning about the potential dangers of blind obedience and the importance of questioning authority in situations where it may conflict with personal values or ethical principles. While Milgram's study revealed unsettling truths about human nature and obedience, it also sparked important discussions on the ethics of research and the responsibility of psychologists and researchers to protect their subjects from harm. Today, Milgram's experiment remains one of the most studied and discussed pieces of research in psychology, serving as a powerful reminder of how social influence and authority can shape human actions in profound and sometimes dangerous ways. It challenges us to reflect on the ethical dimensions of research and the limits of obedience in our own lives. Live vivisection experiments conducted by Dr. Shiro Ishii and his team during World War II represent some of the most horrifying and inhumane atrocities ever committed under the guise of scientific research. Dr. Ishii, a Japanese military physician and microbiologist, was the head of Unit 731, a covert biological warfare research and development unit of the Imperial Japanese Army. This unit, which operated from 1935 to 1945, was responsible for some of the most brutal and torturous medical experiments on live human beings, many of which were conducted without consent and with the intent of advancing Japan's biological warfare capabilities. The term vivisection refers to the practice of performing surgical operations on living organisms, often without anesthesia, in order to study the body's internal processes. While dissection is a standard practice in medical education, the experiments conducted by Dr. Ishii and his colleagues went far beyond anything scientifically acceptable. These so-called medical experiments were not focused on any legitimate scientific pursuit, but rather were intended to gather information on how the human body could be used as a subject for biological warfare, often with gruesome and torturous methods. Dr. Ishii and his team experimented on thousands of Chinese civilians, prisoners of war, and other individuals captured during Japan's military campaigns in Asia. These victims, often referred to as logs or maryuta, meaning logs in Japanese, a term used to dehumanize them, were subjected to horrific procedures. These experiments included live dissections, where individuals were opened up without anesthesia to study the effects of various pathogens and diseases on the human body. The victims were often injected with bubonic plague, cholera, anthrax, or typhus, and then observed as they succumbed to the effects of the disease. Some were even dissected while still alive to observe the progression of the diseases within their internal organs. The primary goal of these experiments was to advance Japan's biological warfare capabilities. Ishii and his team aimed to understand how diseases could spread among large populations, how pathogens could be used as weapons, and how best to deploy them in wartime. But the methods they used were nothing short of barbaric. Victims were infected with deadly pathogens, then subjected to horrific surgical procedures to study the effects of the diseases on the body. Some individuals had their organs removed, including lungs, hearts, and kidneys, while still alive, to see how long they could survive without them. In addition to the live dissections, there were also frostbite experiments, where prisoners were subjected to freezing temperatures to study the effects of frostbite. The victims were immersed in freezing water, left to suffer frostbite, and then had their limbs amputated to observe the damage done by the cold. There were also experiments involving germ warfare, where people were exposed to deadly pathogens like plague or anthrax in an effort to develop biological weapons. The victims often died in agonizing pain, either from the infections, the surgeries, or the horrific conditions under which they were kept. The extent of the atrocities committed by Unit 731 is unimaginable. Tens of thousands of men, women, and children, primarily Chinese, but also prisoners from Russia, Korea, and other territories under Japanese occupation, were subjected to these brutal experiments. The victims were often held in squalid conditions, starved, and given little to no medical treatment, aside from the horrific experiments that would be conducted on them. Many were executed after the experiments, with their bodies disposed of in an attempt to cover up the evidence of the crimes. What is perhaps most disturbing about Dr. Ishii's experiments is that after the war ended, the Japanese government and military sought to protect Ishii and his colleagues from prosecution for war crimes. In exchange for their cooperation in sharing the findings of their gruesome research with the United States, Ishii and other members of Unit 731 were granted immunity from prosecution during the Tokyo war crimes trials. As a result, Dr. Ishii was never held accountable for his role in the atrocities that took place under his command. The horrifying legacy of Unit 731 and its live vivisection experiments remains a dark chapter in the history of warfare and medical ethics. The human suffering that took place in the name of science was unimaginable, and the ethical violations committed during these experiments stand as a powerful reminder of the dangerous intersection of science, power, and military ambition. The victims of Unit 731, whose identities were often erased or lost to history, suffered unimaginable pain and death for the sake of cruel and ultimately meaningless research. Dr. Ishii's experiments were a grave violation of basic human rights and dignity, and they have been universally condemned as some of the most heinous acts in the history of war. In the years following World War II, there was limited acknowledgement of the atrocities carried out by Unit 731, due to the cover-up efforts by the Japanese military and the subsequent political protection provided by the United States in exchange for the research data. The victims of Unit 731 were denied justice, and it wasn't until decades later that the full scope of these experiments came to light, sparking outrage and a renewed call for accountability for those responsible. While Dr. Ishii and his colleagues were never held accountable for their actions, the legacy of Unit 731 remains a potent reminder of the abuses of scientific power and the importance of protecting the human rights of every individual, regardless of their nationality, race, or status. The radioactive food experiments conducted in the United States during the 1940s and 1950s were part of a disturbing series of studies that tested the effects of radiation on human health, often without the consent of those involved. These experiments, conducted by various government agencies, including the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, AEC, and the U.S. military, aimed to understand the impact of radiation on human tissue and organs, especially in the context of nuclear warfare and the emerging atomic age. Unfortunately, many of these experiments were carried out under highly unethical conditions, with the participants being unaware of the risks they were being exposed to. In the years following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, the United States began investing heavily in nuclear research, and scientists wanted to better understand the long-term effects of radiation exposure. The purpose of these experiments was not to study the effects of nuclear fallout on entire populations, but rather to examine how radiation affected individual humans, particularly when it was ingested in food or water. Researchers were interested in determining whether certain foods or substances could absorb radioactive materials and how these materials would interact with the body. One of the most infamous sets of experiments involved feeding radioactive substances to unwitting participants, many of whom were either hospital patients or prisoners, without their knowledge or consent. In the early days of these experiments, researchers believed that radiation exposure to food might have benefits, such as sterilizing food or improving its nutritional value. However, these experiments quickly turned into studies on the dangerous effects of ingesting radioactive substances. For instance, some participants were given food that was deliberately contaminated with radioactive isotopes, like strontium-90 or radium-226, and instructed to eat or drink the contaminated products. These food items were often marketed as health products or as normal food that contained harmless radiation, even though the radiation could lead to serious health complications. Other experiments involved injecting radioactive materials directly into the bloodstream of participants or feeding them food and drinks laced with radioactive elements to see how long it would take for the radioactive material to accumulate in the body and its organs. One of the more shocking aspects of these experiments was the willingness of government agencies to conduct them without proper ethical considerations, or the consent of the individuals involved. In many cases, participants were told that they were being treated for medical conditions, or that they were simply participating in scientific studies, with no mention of the risks involved. In some cases, the individuals who were fed radioactive food had no idea they were being exposed to potentially lethal amounts of radiation until much later in their lives. The long-term effects of these experiments were devastating. Many of the participants developed cancer, particularly bone cancer, leukemia, and thyroid cancer, which are known to be linked to radiation exposure. Some participants developed serious organ damage, while others experienced radiation burns, internal bleeding, and other long-term side effects. These experiments were conducted under the assumption that the data would help develop better ways to protect the public from radiation, but they also serve to underscore the complete disregard for the safety and well-being of the individuals who were unwittingly made part of these studies. One particularly notorious case involved the feeding of radium-laced oatmeal to hospital patients in the late 1940s. These patients, many of whom were already ill, were given the oatmeal without their consent, and the effects of the radioactive material on their bodies were closely monitored. Another infamous example occurred at the University of California, Berkeley, where students were unknowingly given food laced with radioactive tracers to observe how radiation would be absorbed by the body. The students were not informed about the potential risks, and many of them suffered the consequences in the years that followed. Despite the growing evidence of the harmful effects of radiation, these experiments continued for several decades, with the government and researchers justifying their actions by claiming that the studies were necessary for national defense and public safety. It wasn't until the 1970s, after public outcry and increasing awareness of the dangers of radiation, that these experiments were fully exposed and criticized. The victims of the experiments were often left without any form of compensation or support, and many suffered from lifelong health problems as a result of their exposure to radioactive substances. In the decades following the end of these experiments, there was a significant push for greater ethical standards in medical and scientific research. The revelations of these experiments led to the establishment of stronger regulations and ethical guidelines for human experimentation, including the National Research Act of 1974 and the establishment of institutional review boards, IRBs, to oversee the safety of human subjects in research. While these experiments from the 1940s and 1950s were justified at the time under the guise of advancing scientific knowledge, they serve as a grim reminder of the dangers of unchecked scientific experimentation and the importance of respecting human dignity, rights, and consent in research practices. The radioactive food experiments highlight the dark side of scientific progress, where the pursuit of knowledge was prioritized over the safety and rights of individuals. These experiments were a tragic violation of trust, and the damage done to the participants serves as a reminder of the importance of ethical oversight in scientific research. The legacy of these experiments continues to shape the way in which human subjects are treated in research today, ensuring that such atrocities are never repeated. The sleep deprivation experiment conducted by the Soviet Union in the 1940s is one of the most chilling and controversial studies in the history of psychological research. This experiment was a part of a series of military-funded studies aimed at understanding the limits of human endurance and how extreme conditions could impact a person's mind and body. What made this particular experiment so disturbing was the extreme and inhumane methods employed by Soviet researchers in their quest to explore the consequences of sleep deprivation. During this time, the Soviet government was deeply invested in military research and psychological warfare, seeking ways to enhance soldiers' capabilities, endurance, and resilience. Sleep deprivation was considered a potential tool for manipulating human behavior and testing how the mind would respond to prolonged periods of exhaustion. The study was conducted in a secret military facility, and its details remained largely classified for many years, contributing to the mystery and horror surrounding the experiment. The experiment involved a group of young men, typically soldiers or prisoners, who were subjected to severe and extended periods of total sleep deprivation. The goal was to determine how long a person could go without sleep and what kind of mental and physical breakdowns would occur as a result. The subjects were placed in isolated rooms, where they were forbidden from sleeping for days, weeks, and in some cases, even longer. The researchers provided no sleep aids or interventions, allowing the participants to experience the full effects of sleep deprivation without any assistance or relief. As the days went on, the subjects began to experience severe mental and physical deterioration. Initially, the participants exhibited heightened alertness, but as time passed, their cognitive functions began to degrade. They experienced intense hallucinations, where they would see and hear things that weren't there, as well as paranoia and extreme mood swings. Some began to show signs of severe disorientation and confusion, unable to distinguish between reality and their distorted perceptions. In addition to these mental effects, the lack of sleep also caused physical symptoms, including muscle tremors, impaired coordination, and loss of motor skills. The psychological toll on the participants became even more apparent as the experiment dragged on. As their brains became increasingly deprived of the rest they needed, they began to suffer from severe emotional breakdowns. Many of the participants experienced extreme agitation, uncontrollable crying, and violent outbursts. Others fell into deep states of depression and catatonia, unable to communicate or move. Despite the worsening conditions, the researchers continued to push the subjects beyond their limits, believing that the data they were collecting would help them understand how to manipulate soldiers and civilians in wartime situations. The ethical violations of this experiment are appalling. The participants were not informed about the true nature of the study or the risks involved. In many cases, they were not given any option to opt out or stop the experiment once it had begun. The lack of sleep for such extended periods of time was not only dangerous but also inhumane. Sleep is a basic human need, and depriving individuals of it for long periods can lead to irreversible physical and mental damage. The fact that the Soviet researchers allowed their subjects to endure this suffering in the name of experimentation shows a complete disregard for the health, well-being, and rights of the participants. As the experiment continued, the mental states of the subjects deteriorated to the point of complete breakdowns. Many became so disoriented that they were unable to remember their own names or personal details. Some began to experience severe memory loss, while others began to engage in bizarre and erratic behaviors, further confirming the extreme effects of prolonged sleep deprivation. In the most severe cases, some participants succumbed to the trauma of the experiment, with some even dying from the extreme stress and exhaustion they endured. The exact number of casualties is unknown, as the details of the experiment were kept secret for many years. The findings of this sleep deprivation experiment were never fully published or disclosed to the public, but it is believed that the Soviet government used the results for various military and psychological purposes. It's likely that the data collected on the effects of sleep deprivation influenced the development of psychological warfare tactics and may have been used to exploit soldiers' weaknesses or to develop methods of torture and interrogation. The legacy of this experiment is a grim reminder of the extremes to which governments and institutions can go in the pursuit of knowledge, particularly when ethical considerations are abandoned. The sleep deprivation study conducted by the Soviet Union serves as a horrifying example of the potential for abuse in the name of scientific research and the complete disregard for human dignity and rights. It also underscores the importance of ethical standards in scientific experimentation, particularly when the subjects of such studies are vulnerable individuals who are unable to protect themselves from exploitation. In modern times, the ethical principles of informed consent, human rights, and the protection of research participants have been established as critical guidelines for conducting research. The sleep deprivation experiment from the Soviet era serves as a haunting example of how easily these principles can be violated when the subjects of experimentation are viewed as mere tools for gaining knowledge, rather than as human beings deserving of respect and care. The suffering endured by the participants in this study should never be forgotten, as it highlights the dangers of unchecked scientific curiosity and the need for strict oversight and accountability in research practices. The hepatitis experiment conducted at the Willowbrook State School in Staten Island, New York, during the 1950s to 1970s, is one of the most infamous and ethically disturbing medical studies in the history of the United States. This experiment involved deliberately infecting children with the hepatitis virus in an effort to study the progression of the disease and to develop a vaccine, all without the informed consent of the participants or their families. The Willowbrook study remains a stark example of the severe ethical violations that can occur when vulnerable individuals are used as experimental subjects. Willowbrook State School, originally established in the late 19th century, was a residential facility for children with intellectual disabilities. By the 1950s, the facility had become overcrowded, with many children living in deplorable conditions, suffering from neglect and lack of proper care. It was in this environment that the controversial hepatitis studies began, initially as an attempt to understand the high rates of hepatitis observed among the children at Willowbrook. The researchers, led by Dr. Saul Krugman, believed that studying hepatitis in a controlled setting could provide valuable insights into the disease, which was largely mysterious at the time. The researchers found that children at the facility were frequently contracting hepatitis, largely due to the unsanitary conditions in which they lived. Krugman and his team saw this as an opportunity to deliberately infect children with the virus in order to study how the disease progressed. However, instead of attempting to prevent the infections, they chose to intentionally expose these vulnerable children to the hepatitis virus, believing that it would provide an ideal model for understanding the disease. To carry out the study, researchers obtained consent from the children's parents, but this consent was obtained under highly questionable circumstances. The parents were often told that their children needed to participate in the study in order to receive care at the Willowbrook facility. Many parents, who had little other options for care and were often desperate, agreed to have their children involved in the experiment, not fully understanding the risks and the nature of the study. The researchers did not fully disclose the extent of the potential harm to the children or the fact that they were being deliberately infected with a potentially dangerous virus. The experiment itself involved exposing children to the hepatitis virus through various methods, including injecting the virus into their bloodstreams and having them consume contaminated food or drink. The researchers carefully monitored the children's symptoms and progression of the disease, noting the onset of symptoms such as fever, fatigue, jaundice, and liver damage. Some children became seriously ill, with long-term complications, while others did not show significant symptoms. However, the researchers did not provide adequate care or treatment for the children, as the primary goal of the study was to observe the natural progression of the disease, rather than to alleviate suffering. The ethical violations in the Willowbrook hepatitis experiments were numerous and egregious. First and foremost, the children involved were subjected to deliberate harm without their consent and without a full understanding of the risks involved. They were essentially used as human guinea pigs in a study that exposed them to serious illness, all for the sake of advancing scientific knowledge. Moreover, the study was conducted in an environment where the children were already vulnerable, living in a state-run facility that was overcrowded, underfunded, and lacking in adequate medical care. The fact that the researchers did not provide proper treatment for the children, nor did they attempt to mitigate the harm caused by the hepatitis virus, is a clear indication of the complete disregard for the children's well-being. As the study continued, it became clear that the researchers were more interested in collecting data than in the welfare of the children. In some cases, the children were repeatedly infected with the hepatitis virus, and in some instances, the infection was induced in children who had already suffered from the disease. The long-term effects of the hepatitis infection were not studied in depth, and the children who survived the initial infection were often left with lasting liver damage. Many of the children experienced chronic health issues, including liver cirrhosis and other long-term complications, yet there was little effort to provide them with proper care or follow-up treatment. The Willowbrook hepatitis experiment was not widely known until the 1970s, when investigative journalist Ernest A. Freeberg published a report that exposed the shocking details of the study. The revelations about the deliberate infection of children caused public outrage and led to increased scrutiny of the ethics of human experimentation. The Willowbrook study became a major turning point in the history of medical ethics, sparking debates about the informed consent of research participants and the importance of ensuring that experiments involving vulnerable populations are conducted with the utmost care and respect. In the wake of the Willowbrook scandal, there were significant changes in the way that medical research involving human subjects was regulated. New ethical guidelines were established to ensure that all research studies involving humans, especially vulnerable populations such as children, were conducted with the informed consent of the participants and that the risks of harm were minimized. The National Research Act of 1974, which established the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research, was one such reform that aimed to prevent future abuses of this nature. The Willowbrook hepatitis experiments are a tragic reminder of the atrocities that can occur when scientific curiosity is prioritized over the dignity and well-being of individuals. These experiments not only inflicted harm on children who were already vulnerable but also violated the ethical principles that are now considered fundamental in medical research. The legacy of the Willowbrook experiments has been felt for decades, and they serve as a cautionary tale for researchers and policymakers about the importance of human rights and the ethical conduct of research.